today we want to talk about how to write an effective thesis statement for an AP Poetry prompt. With the rubric changing last year, it's very important that we have a good thesis statement that avoids several little pitfalls and does a good job of doing justice to the poem. So we're going to look at it. We don't want to belabor it too much, but we do want to emphasize writing good thesis statements enough to get the good score. Now, I want to remind you that every AP Poetry prompt will have this sort of stable wording. No matter what poem is analyzed, it will say, in this poem, published on this date, the poet reflects upon whatever the subject of the poem is. Then it always says, read the poem carefully. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze how the poet uses literary elements and poetic devices to convey something complex in the poem. So the prompt is going to read this way every single time. And typically the word I want to emphasize is complex, because that makes our understanding of the poem interesting. And pretty much it's a guarantee that every poem on the AP exam is going to be complex in some way, that's going to need a little bit of explanation, need a little bit of justification. Otherwise we don't really have an essay to write. Now, this is the prompt. It prompts us on what to write, but I sometimes think it's helpful to translate the prompt into a question. So generally I think that every AP prompt for a poem is asking this question: how does the poet use poetic elements to convey a complex tone and theme? Notice I emphasize the word how and not what. Students like to explain what a poem means. They want to tell us the meaning of the poem right away. And we are interested in what the poem means, that's the bottom of this question, but we're also interested in how the poem means it. Remember, this is a language and literature class, and so we want to talk about what poetic elements are in there. It's crucial to mention those in our essay, or we're not going to have a very effective one. So the word for the day, as I said, is complex. We want to emphasize that we're always interested in the theme and tone of a poem being complex. AP loves complexity. Tones are complex, attitudes are complex, relationships among characters are complex. It sort of goes back to that old Facebook, status, which is, it's complicated. Pretty much everything you see on the AP exam is going to be both accessible but also kind of complicated. We might say the word ambiguous in terms of complexity in some ways. And AP likes it because a lot of life is indeed complex and ambiguous. And if a text is complex, complicated, and ambiguous, then it needs a little bit of explanation. It can't be too obvious or there's really nothing to write about. So in general, complex means usually it means there's a good side of something and there's a bad side of something. A lot of times when I look at any prompt on the AP exam, I'm like, well, on the one hand there's this, and on the other hand there's that, and both of these things are true, and that's kind of complicated. And so we typically want to read a poem, and we don't want to just say that this poem is sad, or say that this poem is happy, or say that this poem is in celebration of somebody's mother. We want to say that just like your feelings towards your mother or father or guardian, they're probably complex. There's good things and bad things about it. So today we're going to look at one sonnet with an AP Poetry prompt and focus on identifying their complex attitudes or tones. So what about that sonnet is complex in some ways? And then we're going to try our hand at writing effective thesis statements that convey those complexities. Okay, so imagine that your teacher has passed out a sonnet and a poetry prompt. What you're going to do is you're going to look carefully at the prompt and see what it prompts you to analyze. Remember, it's always going to have that part of the prompt that says, the artist is reflecting on trees, or the artist is reflecting on how we relate to our environment. It'll give you sort of what the poem is about in the prompt. And so we're going to be asked to say, what is the poet saying about the relationship we have to the environment? Now, you have 40 minutes on the actual exam, so you want to spend 10 minutes just analyzing and annotating, writing on the sonnet or the poem, and making a plan for your thesis and structure. And then 10 minutes planning and annotating, and 30 minutes writing is generally what you're going to do. So remember, when we're looking at a sonnet, there's many things that we do right away. One is we check out its rhyme scheme. Is it Petrarchan? Is it Shakespearean? We look at the sentences. I like to draw lines for every part of the poem. I'm like, okay, that's a complete thought, and that's a complete thought. This is more difficult if the poem does not have punctuation, but if it does, we look for those big stops like periods. I usually divide the poem up into those syntactic units. And then because sonnets traditionally have a shift or volta, which are great for complexity, I try to find like where's the shift or the volta. If it's an old poem, it's probably going to be obvious. It'll be between the 8th line and the 9th line. And then because it's AP, we always want to look for poetic devices. What diction's being used, what imagery, what figures of speech, where are the similes, the metaphors, the personification, the hyperboles. How is rhyme being used effectively? So you look for all the things that make a poem a poem. And then you just kind of remind yourself who is speaking, who are they speaking to, what are they speaking about. And even though the prompt tells you what the subject of the sonnet is, you need to kind of restate it to yourself. Okay, this sonnet is generally about this. Generally, I say poems are celebrations or lamentations or indictments or something like that. So what is this poem doing? And finally, the most important thing is we need to identify the poet's complex attitude toward that subject, especially if there's a shift. If the poet is meditating on the environment, does the poet have an ambiguous relationship to the environment? If the poet is speaking to someone they have a crush on, what's their ambiguous relationship toward that crush? Now, when it comes to the thesis statement, we do not want to just restate the prompt. The prompt never has any flavor. It tells us what the poem is meditating on, but it doesn't tell us the poet's attitude or tone toward that particular subject. So we cannot just restate the prompt. We cannot just say that the poem uses certain poetic effects. Like, in this poem, the poet uses powerful diction and imagery. Well, that still doesn't tell us the tone or what the poet's attitude is. So we can't just claim poetic devices. We have to talk about tone. Every thesis statement has to have that flavor in it, or it doesn't really do the job. Now, I don't want you to get too hung up on making a thesis statement perfect because you don't have a lot of time. You need to just sort of shoot to kill and hit the thesis really hard. But I do want you to take a little bit of time and effort to sum up the complexity of the poem effectively and clearly. Now, because you're going to be working with sonnets, I don't want to give you the answers, so to speak, about the thesis, but let's look at some example thesis statements. First, I'll show you the pattern, and then I'll like general patterns, and then I'll show you 2 example thesis statements based on a poem that we're not studying. Now, generally, there's a good basic thesis where you just say, in this poem, this poet uses these devices to convey a complex tone or theme. Now, that's the most important part. All the rest of it is kind of restating the prompt a little bit, although you're the one who's filling in the poetic devices. But it's the complex tone and theme that really is essential to having a good thesis. Now, you're not stuck with this basic thesis. You can be more natural and free and fluent in your writing. You can do a little bit fancier. I generally always try to have a sort of half and half thesis and say, while this poem or poet is doing this, they're also kind of doing this at the same time. There's a little bit of complexity there. Now, notice I didn't mention poetic devices in this thesis statement. As long as the poetic devices are name-checked and mentioned and their effect is described in the essay, I think that it's fine. Let's imagine, I know you haven't read this poem, or maybe you have, but it's Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. And I was asked, of course, to identify, this poet's attitude toward his father, because it's a father-son poem. My basic thesis might read, in Those Winter Sundays, Robert Hayden uses powerful diction and imagery to convey the guilt he feels for never thanking his father for all he did for him. Now, maybe this isn't as complex as it needs to be because it just focuses upon the guilt that Robert Hayden is feeling. I probably need to add a little bit of, yet there's love for the father, and that's why he's feeling guilty. So maybe it's missing in my thesis statement, but if I unpack it in my essay, I think I can still get away with it. Let's look at my little fancier thesis. In Those Winter Sundays, Hayden clearly did not get along with his father when he was younger, but now that he is older, he feels love and guilt about their difficult relationship. That maybe is a little wordy, but you can definitely see that I'm touching on the complexity of the poem in terms of he feels love, he feels guilty, their relationship was difficult, it was complicated, it was hard, and that's going to be more in line with what the poem's actually doing. And remember that the AP exam is going to give you a poem that kind of moves at 2 levels at least, so there's something to talk about. So the thesis statement is very important because it's one point of the rubric, but it's also like something we shouldn't spend 10 minutes on. We just kind of need to get a good feel for the poem and its complexity and express it as fast as we possibly can.